I see more of a sort of accounting fiddle. You know, it was a way of bringing money into the system, but actually it's the public sector which has to shoulder the burden of paying it back.
Private sector, the library, Brighton, the library, it's obviously paid by public money.
Sure. Well, I mean, public libraries are also at the sharp end of the whole privatisation process, and you know, we all know that public libraries have been taken out of our city fabric increasingly, and they are also sites for protest, and actually sometimes successful protests, like the library in Barnet. Yeah.
So I'm a bit curious about what places we can protest in. So, and when the Guardian during Occupy started a map,
Yeah.
you know that. And I'm curious, did you take that on?
Yeah, the Guardian journalist who wrote that piece, I actually wrote a accompanying piece to it, and I talked to him a lot about it. He was very excited about his map. Basically, the Guardian did a series of articles, and they wanted to have an interactive map where people would contribute, like, their knowledge of private places, you know, where they live. But actually, you know, people just didn't really contribute to it, you know. And I've actually, well, yes, I've written a book, but I mean, I can't map every private place. You know, I mean, I know that I mean, I've actually been in touch with another Guardian journalist called Jack Schenker, who covered the Egyptian revolution for the Guardian, and he's writing a book about that, but he's also interested in the privatisation of public space, and he's now doing a piece for the Guardian looking at the privatisation of the Thames Path and the restrictions there to the river. But he wants to revive that map, and he hopes that his piece will sort of, you know, set people interested in it again. That is a tool for people who are interested in the privatisation of public space. That Guardian map is there, and it's just waiting for contributions. And if
We even find out what's private, so we have to protest on places.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, that's the real difficulty. It's a really insidious process, and it is hard to tell very often. I mean, there are giveaways. You know, in Canary Wharf or in other private parts of the city, you know, Paddington Waterside, Regent's Place. These places are all over London. There are giveaways. The fact that it's private land. You know, there are little plaques which will say privately owned. More London, where the Greater London Authority has its HQ. That's a private space. But yet it is often difficult to tell, and people don't really notice it. So yeah, that Guardian map, you know, it's a resource, and hopefully, you know, the forthcoming article will give it a little bit more of a push.
Yeah. Can you tell us maybe of some places that are private that we might not know?
Well, I mean, they're just everywhere. You know, most new places you can think of will be under this model, and other places are very likely to be part of a business improvement district company. So there's a business improvement district company in the West End, which has red uniformed security guards. There's a business improvement district company in Holborn. There's one in Fitzrovia. You know, they're all over London. There's probably, you know, coming up to 100 in London alone. I mean, private places would range from the Olympic Village, Westfield Stratford City, More London. The South Bank is a mishmash of private space. Next to More London, there's a space called Hayes Galleria. There's a little place called Cardinal Place just behind Victoria Station. I mean, the whole city is actually, you know, home to all these places. I don't know all of them off the top of my head. Having said that, you know, there are big parts of the city which don't have these spaces at all. You know, and I mean, I lived in Brixton for many years. You know, there aren't many spaces like this in Brixton. There are not many spaces like this where I live now, just 10 minutes down the road. So, you know, much of the city does still remain free of this model, but certainly in central parts, particularly parts where there's big shopping areas, tourist areas, these tend to be at the forefront of privatisation.
They're allowed people to protest the pavement in the front of the square.
What, here?
Public area.
To be honest, this square has its own special rules and regulations which have been created
At the front of the
specifically.
square, there is a pavement, public
Right,
access.
right.
They're allowed sitting there.
Okay.
Yes.
All
They're
right.
allowed, yes or no?
Look, I'm no more
This is
expert on the
private.
on the details of each
square is
space.
private, but the
No, the
public
square
access-
isn't private. The square is public. This is, you know, a very public part of London. It is not private, but it's got its own rules and regulations and an approach to public space which has been imported from this privatized model. So you've got the private security guards, but you have very specific rules about this space. But no, this space isn't actually private, which is in itself worrying, because as a public space in the centre of our democracy, you know, it should be functioning as an open space.
What rules they have for that pavement? What rules for that pavement?
I don't know.
Because people are allowed sitting there to protest in the front of the square, on the pavement. You see, where the officer police is there, sitting there.
I mean, I would have thought if they were allowed to be protesting there, they would be. So
Because the police, they make their own law. They are coming to you. That's why they say this is the law, but there's no proof that that's the law.
well, the law has a funny habit of changing.
Policing social act.
Yeah.
That's very vague. That gives them the right to be discerning. That's the problem. We should have a discerning police.
You actually have been waiting ages.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for your book. It's really good. The residential areas and parks are also being privatised. The park and whole residential area and streets around the Haygate estate in Elephant Castle, the streets and the park are going to be privatised. That's been done by a Labour council in Southwark.
Yeah.
So just for
Well, that's a
information.
huge theme, actually, and that's a separate discussion. Well, it's part of the same discussion, but all around London, we're also seeing the demolition of.
Finish my.
Sorry.
It's okay. I just want to say that residential areas and parks are being privatised by Labour councils in Southwark. But my question was, I've read your book. You're doing brilliant stuff in exposing the issue, but there was no real solution in your book except just fight it. Has anybody ever suggested that we need an act of parliament that gives us the same rights as we have in public spaces on these new public spaces that are privately owned? Because that to me would be a really good solution to lobby our MPs to say, look, we're not being allowed to have political action, we're not allowed to have filming, we're not allowed to have cameras, and not allowed to have kids.
No, I'm not counting.
And so therefore, can we not actually put together a Public Space Protection Act, Rights and Responsibilities Act, to restore our act? So I think that might be a suggestion of how we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, what I would prefer. I would prefer that the streets were not allowed to come under the control of developers in the first place. I mean, I think once they have done, it's like the horse is out the door, you know. It's,
Actually get the horse back in the door.
yeah, I mean, what I would prefer is that we have such an active debate over the privatisation of streets that these new parts of London which are planned, like around the Elephant and Castle, like you've said, you know, where the Haygate estate's being demolished, that it would be a hot political issue and developers wouldn't be allowed to have control of the streets. But, I mean, I think the idea of having an Act of Parliament which would allow free access to private places, in a way, is what happened in the 19th century when you had these great estates and they didn't allow public access. Actually, I'm not familiar with the legislation, but it would probably be worth somebody researching that legislation, how that was constructed and how thereafter it was said that local authorities should have control of the streets. So, yeah, I mean, I think this is a sort of, you know, good line of inquiry to follow. But I agree, my book didn't offer a blueprint for change. I mean, that's the hard work.
Shame on you.
I know. Well, no, I mean, I hope that what I do next will look at real solutions, because I don't think there is enough really being done about sort of proper alternatives.
Changing the political complexion, you know, to the remedy we need is local councils and national governments to control this. And because we've had this sweeping tide of what we call neoliberalism, the obsession that everything has to be opened up to the market. The most current example is where publicly owned land is being sold off in order to raise money because of the so-called national debt, the austerity. We're supposed to be in straitened times, which we know is a lie, but they're using this as a justification for selling off yet more public spaces. But it comes down to actually getting getting councils and national government under political control, where they don't want this to happen, and they will stop doing it. But it's an uphill task. I mean, we've got the consensus among the major parties that this is the way we have to go. I'm hoping that the tide is going to turn. From my own personal point of view, I'm in the Labour Party, a member of the Labour Representation Committee, which was set up with the idea of reclaiming the party and making it a real Labour Party again, following its hijacking by the new Labour project. But I mean, they went down that road, but they came in after the Thatcher government, and it's true that they introduced some very useful reforms, but they carried on with that agenda of privatisation. And someone mentioned the private finance initiative. The government put enormous resources into the health service and education by using PFI, which is a card, which to keep it off the public sector borrowing accounts. So, and that was partly to satisfy European Union requirements that the member states wouldn't borrow above a certain level. So, as several people